The sun slowly rose over the Malibu coastline, its golden rays spilling through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, casting soft shadows on the polished wooden floor. The rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the shore played like a distant lullaby. Joy Smith stirred, the warmth of sunlight caressing her skin, pulling her from the remnants of a dream. A scent lingered in the air, salty ocean breeze mixed with something else, something familiar. Her heartbeat quickened, and before her mind could process the feeling, her eyes fluttered open. The room was vast, bathed in soft California light. Expansive glass panels revealed an endless stretch of deep blue ocean. A gentle breeze slipped through a slightly open window, carrying the breath of the sea. And then she saw David Anderson. He stood just a few steps away, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers as if time had never passed. His gray shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, his dark hair slightly tousled by the ocean wind. Her throat tightened, her heart pounded violently against her ribcage. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be him, not after 5 years apart. "David!" Her voice barely escaped her lips, rough with disbelief. He didn't blink. A flicker of emotion crossed his face. Too many emotions to name. "Hello, Joy." 5 years ago, on a gentle April evening, the last golden rays of sunlight stretched across the glass towers of San Francisco, casting long, shimmering reflections. Inside a grand real estate exhibition, laughter and conversations blended with the clinking of wine glasses, filling the air with an energy both sophisticated and electric. It was a gathering of the most influential architects and investors in the industry, a place where deals were made, ideas were born, and careers were shaped. Among the crowd stood Joy Smith, a young and passionate architect, her eyes gleaming with excitement as she presented her latest project, a vision of sustainable living spaces. To her, natural light was not just a design element, it was the soul of a home. She spoke with a confidence that made people stop and listen, her hands moving expressively as she described how a house could breathe with its surroundings, how it could become a sanctuary. But just as she was lost in her explanation, an unexpected accident changed everything. She stepped back slightly, unaware of the electrical cord trailing behind her. A brief moment of imbalance, just enough to send her glass of red wine tilting forward. Time slowed as the deep crimson liquid splashed onto the pristine white shirt of the man standing nearby. The room fell silent. Joy gasped, "Oh no, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Frantically, she grabbed a napkin and reached forward, attempting to blot the stain, but only succeeded in spreading it further. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. Then, to her utter surprise, the man chuckled. "I wasn't aware this event came with a complimentary wine bath." Her eyes darted up and locked onto an intense, ocean-blue gaze. David Anderson. His name was well known. A rising star in the world of real estate development, David had built an empire of high-end properties across California. He was sharp, ambitious, and carried an air of effortless confidence that made people pay attention when he spoke. And right now, instead of being annoyed, he was looking at her with unmistakable amusement. Around them, murmurs of laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone even clapped, as if this were part of the night's entertainment. Joy's mortification deepened. I can buy you a new shirt," she stammered, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. David shook his head, eyes twinkling. "Not necessary, but if you're going to turn me into an abstract painting, at least tell me your name." For a second, she just stared at him, caught between embarrassment and intrigue. Then, despite herself, she let out a small laugh. Joy Smith." David extended his hand, grasping hers in a firm but warm shake. "David Anderson. And I think I just found a reason to stay at this exhibition a little longer." And that was how it all began. That night, after the event, they left together and found a quiet cafe nearby. Under the soft glow of dim yellow lights, they sat across from each other, lost in conversation for hours. Joy spoke about her designs, her dream of creating homes that weren't just structures but sanctuaries, spaces that could bring warmth and harmony to those who lived in them. David listened intently, occasionally tilting his head as if memorizing every word. In return, he told her about his journey, his vision of not just building skyscrapers but creating environments where people felt truly at home. Somewhere between coffee refills and easy laughter, something shifted. The connection between them deepened over the days that followed. They walked along the Golden Gate Bridge at sunset, the wind tangling Joy's hair as she laughed, while David watched her with an expression so soft, so filled with something unspoken, that she felt her heartbeat falter. Late at night, she sat in her tiny apartment, sketching blueprints under the glow of a desk lamp, while David sat across from her, watching in quiet admiration. "You're most beautiful when you're working," he once whispered, his breath warm against her ear. And when stress consumed her, when a project felt too overwhelming, he would place a steady hand on her back and say, "You've got this. I believe in you." She fell for him, slowly, deeply, irrevocably. And one cold winter evening, after watching a dazzling light show in the city, David took her hand and pulled her into the rain-soaked streets of San Francisco. He turned to face her, his gaze more serious than she had ever seen. "Joy," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I want to build a future with you, a home by the ocean, where you can sketch in the morning light and I can sit beside you just watching, a life where I get to see your smile every day. Will you marry me?" The rain poured around them, but she barely felt it. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of happiness, disbelief, and overwhelming love. She let out a laugh, her voice trembling. "Yes, yes, David, I'll marry you," he grinned, slipping the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply as the city lights shimmered around them. They had believed, in that moment, that their love was unbreakable. But they didn't know that in just a few weeks, everything would change forever. Winter had settled over San Francisco, its cold winds weaving through the city streets, whispering against the glass windows of a small apartment, a place once filled with laughter, warmth, and love. David Anderson thought everything was perfect. He had Joy Smith, he had their dreams, he had a future that felt unshakable. What he didn't know was that one conversation had changed everything. That afternoon, while Joy was sorting through her sketches, Richard Anderson, David's father, arrived unannounced. He wasted no time. "You're not the right person for David." His voice was calm, but sharp as a blade. Joy felt the blood drain from her face. "David turned down a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in London because of you. A project that could elevate his career beyond imagination. And for what? To stay here? To throw away his future?" The words struck her like thunder. She wanted to argue, to tell him that David didn't need London, that they could build a future together. But deep inside, fear crept in. David was a man with ambition, with dreams too big for this small apartment. If he had already given something up for her, would there be a day when he regretted it? That night, Joy sat alone, staring at the engagement ring on her finger. She thought about their promises, their plans, their whispered dreams beneath city lights. But now, she wasn't sure if she was meant to stay in that dream. "If you truly love him, you'll let him go," Richard's voice echoed in her mind. Her hands trembled as she picked up a pen and wrote a single note. "Go chase your dreams. You deserve the world." She slipped the ring off her finger, setting it beside the note. A silent farewell. And then she walked away. That night, David arrived home, a bouquet of white roses in hand. They had argued earlier about his long working hours, and he wanted to make it up to her. He imagined her answering the door, pretending to be mad, only to smile when he pulled her into his arms. But instead, he found silence. The apartment was empty. His chest tightened. He turned, spotting a small note on the table. He read the words again and again, refusing to believe them. Then he ran. The rain poured as he sprinted to the train station, his breath heavy, eyes scanning frantically. And then he saw her. Joy stood inside the train, just beyond the glass doors. "Joy!" he shouted, desperation breaking in his voice. She turned, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment, filled with pain, regret, and unspoken words. The doors closed. The train pulled away, taking her with it. David stood there, drenched in rain, clutching the note. The white roses slipped from his grasp, petals scattering onto the wet pavement. like fragments of a love he thought would last forever. Joy Smith left San Francisco on a rainy night, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a shattered heart. She had no clear destination, no grand plan, just the desperate need to get away before her resolve crumbled and she ran back to David. Her first stop was Seattle, a city where the endless gray skies and constant drizzle mirrored the storm inside her. She buried herself in work, taking on any project that could fill the emptiness within her. Her designs became more intricate, more refined, but there was a certain sadness woven into each line, something unspoken, something only she could understand. But no matter how hard she worked, David still haunted her. His smile, the way he whispered against her ear, the warmth of his arms around her, it was all still there, alive in her mind, impossible to erase. After 2 years, she moved to Los Angeles, hoping for a fresh start. Her career soared, and soon she became one of the most sought-after architects in the city. She had everything she had once dreamed of: recognition, success, admiration. And yet, every evening, when she returned to an empty apartment, she felt nothing but the aching absence of the man she left behind. No matter how far she ran, she couldn't outrun the memory of David Anderson. Finally, she accepted a project in Malibu, designing the interiors for a luxury beachfront resort. Maybe the vast ocean, the open sky, would help her find the peace she had been searching for. But the sea only reminded her of him. Every crashing wave took her back to their long walks along the San Francisco Bay. Every golden sunrise mirrored the way he used to look at her, as if she was the only thing that mattered. And every time she stood in front of a blank blueprint, she could almost hear his voice behind her. "You can do this, Joy. I believe in you." She had left him behind, but her heart never truly let him go. On the other side of the country, David Anderson was just as lost. After Joy walked away, he threw himself into work, moving from San Francisco to New York, then to Los Angeles, building an empire, becoming one of the most influential real estate developers in the country. On the surface, he had it all: wealth, power, success, but none of it mattered. He never took off the engagement ring. Every night, he would roll it between his fingers, a silent promise he had never been able to keep. And he never stopped searching for her. From Seattle to Los Angeles, from small boutique firms to high-profile projects, he followed the traces she left behind, recognizing her signature touch in designs that no one else could imitate. But every time he arrived, she was already gone. There were moments where they almost crossed paths. One morning in Los Angeles, Joy sat in a cafe, flipping through an architecture magazine when her eyes landed on a familiar face: David Anderson, standing in front of a newly completed skyscraper, smiling for the camera. But it wasn't the confident, untouchable David she remembered. There was something else in his eyes, a quiet sadness, a longing that time had not erased. She reached out, her fingertips brushing over his photo, her chest tightening. But then, with a deep breath, she closed the magazine and whispered, "You're better off without me, David." She didn't know that just a few blocks away, David stood on the rooftop of a high-rise, holding a blueprint, one that bore unmistakable traces of her design. They had been so close, and yet fate kept pulling them apart, until Malibu changed everything. One summer morning, David received an invitation to survey a new coastal development. He reviewed the interior design proposals, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly, until suddenly he froze. The lines, the balance of space and light. It was her. No hesitation, no second guessing. He stood up immediately. "I need to go there now." He drove from Los Angeles to Malibu, the road stretching endlessly ahead of him, his heartbeat quickening with every passing mile. And when he arrived, the California sun bathed the golden sands, the waves rolling in steady and calm. And then he felt it. She was here. He walked along the shore, scanning every face, every silhouette. And then his breath caught. Joy Smith stood at the water's edge, her brown hair tousled gently by the sea breeze. She wore a loose white shirt, her sleeves rolled up, her bare feet sinking into the cool, wet sand. The waves curled around her ankles, but she remained still, gazing at the horizon, lost in thought. She had no idea that just a few steps away, a man who had never stopped loving her was standing frozen in place, his entire world shifting in that single moment. Back to reality, Joy woke up to the soft glow of morning light filtering through sheer white curtains. Her body felt heavy, her mind foggy, as if she had been drifting between dreams and reality. It took her a few seconds to realize she was no longer on the beach. She blinked, adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings. The spacious room, the modern yet elegant decor, the sound of distant waves crashing against the shore. David! And then she saw him. David Anderson sat in a chair by the window, his expression unreadable, his hands clenched tightly around a glass. The moment he noticed her stirring, he stood up, closing the distance between them in just a few strides. "How do you feel?" His voice was low, strained, with something she couldn't quite decipher. Joy tried to sit up, but her body was still weak. Where am I?" David studied her carefully before answering. "You're in my villa. You collapsed on the beach, Joy. You wouldn't wake up, so I brought you here." Her heart clenched. Even after all these years, he was still the one protecting her. But she couldn't let herself fall into the past. She had made her choice. She had walked away. Taking a shaky breath, she whispered, "David, you shouldn't be here. I'm not a part of your life anymore." Something flickered in his gaze. Pain, disbelief, frustration. Then his voice dropped, rough with emotions he had held back for too long. "Then tell me, Joy, why did you leave me?" She closed her eyes, willing herself not to break. She didn't want to remember. But she couldn't run anymore. With trembling hands, she clutched the blanket over her lap. "I thought I was holding you back. Your father told me that you deserved more, that you could have the world if you weren't tied down because of me." David tensed, his jaw tightening as a bitter chuckle escaped him. "The world?" His eyes locked onto hers, piercing and unrelenting. "Don't you understand, Joy? You are my world." Her breath caught. Before she could respond, David pulled out his phone. Without hesitation, he dialed a number and lifted it to his ear. Her stomach twisted. He was calling Richard Anderson. The line rang once, twice. Then a deep voice answered. "David?" David didn't hesitate. "Dad, we need to talk. Now." A pause, then Richard sighed. "David, this isn't necessary." "What did you say to Joy 5 years ago?" David's voice was sharp, cutting through the space like a blade. Another silence. Then, at last, Richard spoke, his voice lower, slower. "I was wrong." A heavy pause followed. "I thought I was protecting you, but I didn't realize you never needed Paris. You never needed success. You only needed her." Tears welled in Joy's eyes. David turned to her and gently extended the phone. "He wants to speak with you." She hesitated before finally taking it. "Joy?" Richard's voice came through the speaker, filled with something she never thought she'd hear. Regret. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. If you can forgive me, please, go back to David." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She had waited years to hear these words. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Thank you." David ended the call, then turned back to her. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were shaking. Then he reached into his pocket, and when he opened his palm, the engagement ring she had left behind 5 years ago lay there, gleaming softly in the dim light. "I never stopped looking for you, Joy." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I never stopped loving you." Her breath hitched. She stared at the ring, then at him. Slowly, David sank to one knee. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they weren't from heartbreak. This time, she didn't run. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes, David, I will." Life in Malibu was a new beginning, one without separation, without regrets. Together, Joy and David completed their dream project, a luxury resort that wasn't just about architecture. It was a symbol of a love that had found its way back home. But the greatest thing they built wasn't the resort. It was the home they created together. 1 year later, Joy sat beside a pristine white crib, gently rocking their newborn son, Vin Anderson. His deep blue eyes sparkled like the ocean, his soft curls framing his tiny face, a perfect mix of them both. David approached quietly, wrapping his arms around her, pressing a tender kiss to her hair. "Do you know something?" he whispered. Joy leaned back against him. "What?" David gazed down at the family they had built, warmth filling his chest. "I wouldn't trade this for anything in the world." Joy smiled, squeezing his hand. This time, love had truly returned, and they knew it was here to stay.